I remember sitting in a coffee shop and reading Tyndale's The Parable of the Wicked Mammon, and I became so immersed in the text and so sort of captivated by the glorious truth that he was expounding that it was almost as if Tyndale was sat right in front of me. Such is the talent of a great writer or even a great theologian. And Tyndale, I think, is both, but more than that. Yet it is quite extraordinary when we consider that he lived at the time of Henry VIII. But the scriptures say that God is the God of the living and not the dead. And I found myself asking, did not the same eternal spirit live in him that lives in me, and I hope lives in you? Why then should we be surprised if his work and his life, if wrought in God, should not touch us? William Tyndale was born probably round about 1494 in Gloucestershire. He was educated at Oxford and Cambridge University, where he became a strong supporter of church reform. Tyndale lived at a time when the only Bible available to the common people was written in Latin. Now, this was a language that they neither spoke nor understood. And so the word of God was effectively locked away from them in an incomprehensible tongue. In fact, the grasp that ordinary people had on Christianity was largely informed by hearsay and superstition. The word of God was only dimly understood, since church services were largely ritualistic and they were also in Latin. So what was understood by the common people was really shot through with all kinds of error, and most of the things they understood were what were communicated by the figures that they saw in the stained glass windows. It's just amazing when we think about the liberty that we have today just to access the Bible directly, but they did not have that at that time. Now, Tyndale was ordained a priest around about 1521, and he returned to Gloucestershire to serve as a chaplain to the children of a wealthy local landowner called Sir John Walsh. But it was really Tyndale's controversial opinions about the Bible that began to attract the attention of the church authorities. Although John Wycliffe, almost a century before Tyndale, had produced handwritten Bibles, and they were translated from the Latin, the providence of God saw to it that Tyndale was uniquely placed to bring about a Bible revolution, to unlock, as the old children's song puts it, that wonderful treasure, the gift of God without measure, the Bible. Now, there is a revealing confrontation recorded between Tyndale and a local priest, which shows, I think, the zeal and the desire of Tyndale's heart. The clergyman asserted to Tyndale, "We had better be without God's laws than the Pope's." Tyndale responded, "I defy the Pope and all his laws, and if God spare my life, ere many years I will cause the boy that driveth the plough to know more of the Scriptures than thou dost." As an academic, Tyndale had access to certain documents and manuscripts beyond the reach of the common people. He was also immensely gifted in languages. He became fluent in French, Greek, Hebrew, German, Italian, Latin, and Spanish. And between 1517 and 1521, he went to the University of Cambridge, where Erasmus had taught Greek. And it is this connection, really, with the works of Erasmus that really gives Tyndale an important place in the history of the church. Erasmus produced a full copy of the New Testament in Greek, enabling Tyndale to consider the possibility of translating not from Latin, but from the original Greek to English, and therefore making the Word of God finally available to ordinary men and women. In 1523, Tyndale moved to London with the intention of translating the New Testament into English. Now, it must be understood that this was an act that was strictly forbidden on possible pain of death. But as Tyndale puts it in his book, The Obedience of a Christian Man, he says, "God's truth fighteth for us." He goes on to say, "As the weak powers of the world defend the doctrine of the world, so the mighty power of God defendeth the doctrine of God. For if God be on our side, what matter maketh it who be against us?" Tyndale was setting himself against the established Church of England, as these sort of ideas were closely associated with controversial Protestant reformers in Europe, and England soon became a dangerous place for him. In 1524, Tyndale left England for Germany with the aid of London merchants. He hoped to continue his translation work in greater safety, and he sought out the help of none other than Martin Luther himself at Wittenberg. Back in England, even the king became hostile to Tyndale and his translation. In his reply to Luther, Henry VIII castigated the German monk for associating with what he calls one or two lewd persons born in this realm for the translating of the New Testament into English. This is a barely veiled reference to William Tyndale and his associate. So just 1 year after his English New Testament was completed and printed in Cologne in 1525, copies were being smuggled back to England. The first ever Bibles translated from the Greek and written in the English vernacular. The revolution had started. Now, what accelerated Tyndale's mission is quite remarkable. Was the invention of the printing press. God's timing was absolutely perfect. It was now possible to print many more copies of the Word of God than John Wycliffe could ever have imagined. Also, Tyndale's New Testament was quite small, probably about the size of what we would call a compact Bible today, and it was small enough to be hidden. It was easy to conceal should the authorities have any suspicion. Tyndale's translation, whilst being accurate, also had a majesty, if you will, a poetry to it. It was memorable. In fact, when we think of words and phrases really that have entered the English language, the powers that be, an eye for an eye, giving up the ghost, these are all Tyndale's phrases, and many of these are still preserved for us today in the King James Version of the Bible, which uses probably about 85% of Tyndale's New Testament. This was part of Tyndale's gift. He was not just an outstanding scholar and linguist, but he was really a wordsmith. Perhaps even more importantly, he was a godly man. He was faithful to the call that God had put on his life. But it was a life that was about to be cut short. As he devoted himself to translating the Old Testament from Hebrew into English, his pursuers finally caught up with him. Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church in 1534 was really a major catalyst in the English Reformation. Tyndale believed that it was now safe to carry on his work in public, and so he moved to Antwerp in Belgium, and he became less secretive about his activities. Tyndale was finally betrayed by a man called Henry Phillips. Little did he know that Phillips was in fact in the employ of the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, it has been speculated that it was Sir Thomas More that was responsible for sending him to hunt Tyndale down. Tyndale was finally arrested for heresy by imperial authorities and imprisoned in Vilvoorde Castle. On the 6th of October 1536, Tyndale was tried and convicted of heresy and treason. He was put to death by first being strangled and then burned at the stake. Unfortunately, the strangling, which was an act of mercy because of his former ecclesiastical position, was botched, and Tyndale regained consciousness as the flames began to reach his body. Now, it is reported that Tyndale lifted his eyes to heaven and uttered this prayer: "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Just 3 years later, Henry VIII published what became known as the Great Bible, based on Tyndale's work. Although Tyndale's translation of the Old Testament was left unfinished, cut short by his untimely death, his work really can be said to have formed the basis for the subsequent English translations of the Bible, most notably the King James Version of 1611. By the time of Tyndale's death, several thousand copies of his New Testament had been printed. He remains one of the most revered and loved of the English Protestant martyrs. His impact upon the language of the English-speaking people is as significant as that of Shakespeare. But what of Tyndale today? What relevance does he have to Christians living at this time? In May 2013, William Tyndale's words were heard again when Islamic extremists tried to behead a soldier on the streets of Woolwich. One of them shouted, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," unwittingly quoting Tyndale's translation of Christ's words. Ironic that in context they read, "Ye have heard how it is said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." Tragic, violent, wasteful, but perhaps a reminder that Tyndale's Bible will ever be remembered as a work forged in the Reformer's own blood.